Marcus Johnson stood in the gleaming lobby of Stellar Dynamics, his worn jacket and simple jeans a stark contrast to the polished marble and glass. The massive company logo, a silver rocket spiraling around a star, hung on the wall behind reception. Employees in crisp business attire hurried past, some giving him curious glances, others not noticing him at all. His fingers touched the security badge in his pocket, a CEO badge he'd chosen not to wear today. The weight of it felt strange, almost like it belonged to someone else. Just yesterday, he had signed the final paperwork. Today, Stellar Dynamics was his company, but nobody here knew it yet. "I want to see the real company," he had told himself that morning while dressing in his most casual clothes, not the face they put on for the boss. The receptionist had been easy enough to convince. A simple story about a consulting interview, and his pre-registered name in the system was all it took. Now he moved freely through the building, observing, listening, learning things no new CEO would normally see. Marcus took the elevator to the 14th floor, where executive offices lined the halls. His office, though he hadn't seen it yet, waited at the end of the corridor. Instead of heading there, he followed the sound of laughter to a large room with glass doors marked Executive Lounge. Stepping inside, Marcus noticed a group of men in expensive suits gathered around a bar in the corner. Their laughter echoed off the high ceiling as they clinked glasses and spoke loudly. One voice rose above the others, confident, commanding, and dismissive. "This company needs a real leader, not some diversity hire," said a tall white man, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass. His perfect hair and tailored suit probably cost more than Marcus's car. "The board keeps talking about fresh perspectives, but what we need is someone who understands this business." Marcus recognized him immediately from the company files, Richard Whitman, the interim CEO who had expected to get the permanent position. The man who, until yesterday, thought this company would be his. As Marcus approached the coffee machine across the room, Whitman turned, noticing him for the first time. His conversation stopped mid-sentence. The other executives followed his gaze to Marcus, who calmly selected a cup and pressed the button for black coffee. "Hey, this area is for executives only," Whitman sneered, looking Marcus up and down with open disgust. His eyes lingered on Marcus's worn shoes and the small coffee stain on his sleeve. "Janitor's entrance is in the back, buddy. Did you get lost?" The room fell silent. The other men shifted uncomfortably, some staring at their shoes, others watching with curious expressions. No one spoke up. Marcus met Whitman's gaze and smiled. The coffee machine finished brewing, and he took his cup without rushing. "I'm just interested in the company," Marcus said quietly, his voice warm but firm. "Thought I'd look around before my meeting." Whitman stepped closer, towering over Marcus by at least 4 inches. The smell of expensive cologne and whiskey surrounded him like a cloud. "Well, interested doesn't get you into this room. Security clearance does," Whitman laughed, looking back at his colleagues for approval. A few chuckled nervously. "Do you even know what we do here, or did you just wander in off the street?" Marcus took a sip of his coffee, considering the man before him. He had read about Whitman's temper, his intolerance for those he considered beneath him. Now he was seeing it firsthand. "Space propulsion systems," Marcus replied calmly. "You're working on new technology for long-distance travel. I've heard your XR-17 thruster has alignment issues at high temperatures. Probably something to do with the titanium alloy you're using for the central chamber." The room went completely still. Whitman's smile faltered, his confident mask slipping for just a moment. Several executives exchanged worried glances. That information wasn't public. "Who the hell are you to comment on our technology?" Whitman demanded, his voice lower now, suspicious. "Are you from Universal Aerospace? Did they send you to spy on us?" Marcus set his coffee down on a nearby table. He could end this now, reveal who he was, watch this arrogant man crumble. But that wasn't why he came. He wanted to understand the company, not create drama on his first day. Marcus simply extended his hand. Name's Marcus. Marcus Johnson. Whitman didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he pulled out his phone. I'm calling security. We'll see who you really are. Marcus smiled again, knowing tomorrow would come soon enough. That won't be necessary. I was just leaving. He picked up his coffee and headed for the door. See you tomorrow, gentlemen. The grand hall of Stellar Dynamics buzzed with excitement and nervousness. Employees from every department filled the rows of chairs, whispering to each other about the sudden company-wide meeting. Rumors had been spreading for weeks about new leadership, budget cuts, and possible layoffs. The company's financial troubles weren't a secret to anyone who read the quarterly reports. Richard Whitman adjusted his red tie as he stood at the side of the stage, reviewing his notes one last time. He'd prepared a warm introduction for whoever the board had chosen as CEO, followed by his own speech outlining his continued role as Chief Operating Officer. In his mind, the new CEO would be a figurehead, someone to please the investors while he continued running the actual operations. You ready? Asked Thomas Reed, the chairman of the board, as he approached Richard. Born ready, Richard replied with a confident smile. I'll make sure the transition is smooth. Thomas gave him an odd look before walking to the podium at center stage. The room fell silent as he tapped the microphone. Good morning, Stellar Dynamics, Thomas began, his voice echoing through the hall. As you know, the board has been searching for permanent leadership to guide us through these challenging times. We've interviewed dozens of candidates from across the aerospace industry. Richard straightened his posture, preparing to walk forward when introduced. His assistant had placed a glass of water on the small table near where he would sit during the ceremony. Today, I'm proud to introduce the visionary who will take us to the stars, Dr. Marcus Johnson. The side door opened, and Richard froze. Walking confidently onto the stage was the same man he had mocked in the executive lounge just yesterday. But today, Marcus Johnson looked completely different. Gone were the worn jeans and stained jacket. Instead, he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that highlighted his athletic build. His shoes gleamed under the stage lights, and his smile radiated calm authority. Richard's hand knocked against the water glass as he stepped backward in shock. The glass tipped, then crashed to the floor, shattering. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent hall, drawing all eyes to Richard as water spread across the polished wood stage. Marcus turned toward the noise, and their eyes met. Richard's face drained of color as recognition and understanding crashed over him. Yesterday's nobody was today's boss. Marcus nodded slightly before turning back to the audience. He shook Thomas's hand and stepped up to the microphone while a stagehand rushed to clean up the broken glass around Richard's feet. Thank you, Thomas, and good morning, everyone. Marcus began, his voice warm and clear. I'm honored to join the Stellar Dynamics family. This company has a proud history of innovation, but recent years have brought struggles that threaten our future. Richard couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of concrete. 100 thoughts raced through his mind. His mocking words from yesterday, his complaints about diversity hires, his dismissal of the janitor. His career was over. Yesterday, I visited Stellar Dynamics as myself, not as a title or a position, but as a person who cares about this industry. I walked these halls, observed the teams, listened to conversations. What I saw concerned me. Richard stared at his shoes, unable to look up. He could feel hundreds of eyes shifting between him and Marcus, though most employees didn't yet understand the tension. I saw division between departments that should be collaborating. I saw arrogance where there should be openness. I saw talented people whose ideas were ignored because of who they were, not what they knew. Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. But I also saw potential. I saw brilliant minds working on difficult problems. I saw dedication despite the challenges. Marcus set down his notes and leaned forward slightly. Starting today, we value people for their minds, not their appearance or background. We judge ideas on their merit, not on who presents them. From inside his suit jacket, Marcus pulled out rolled blueprint papers. He unfurled them on the podium, revealing complex technical drawings. An assistant quickly set up a display screen showing the same designs enlarged for the audience to see. "This is my design for a revolutionary plasma drive using a new approach to magnetic containment. It's been my life's work for the past decade, and it will save this company. It's lighter, more efficient, and can achieve sustained thrust for longer periods than anything currently on the market." The audience murmured in amazement as they studied the designs. Even Richard, despite his humiliation, couldn't help but look up at the technical specifications scrolling across the screen. As an engineer himself, he recognized the brilliance of the design immediately. Marcus looked directly at Richard. Their eyes met again, and this time Richard couldn't look away. "To lead the development team for this crucial project, I'm appointing Mr. Richard Whitman." Gasps and whispers spread through the audience. Richard's mouth fell open in shock. "His technical knowledge will be tested," Marcus said, with a small, knowing smile. "But I believe everyone deserves the opportunity to rise to a challenge. That starts at the top." 3 weeks had passed since the company-wide meeting, and Richard's life had become a living nightmare. The plasma drive project dominated his days and haunted his nights. Marcus Johnson's design was brilliant but incredibly complex, with solutions to problems Richard hadn't even known existed in propulsion technology. Every morning, he arrived at the lab with dark circles under his eyes, his confidence shrinking with each failed test. "He's setting me up to fail," Richard hissed to his friend Alex in the lab as they examined the latest test results. The prototype had overheated again, melting key components in seconds. After what happened in the executive lounge, he wants revenge. "This project is impossible." Alex looked up from the damaged equipment and shook his head. "Maybe you deserve it," his colleague replied, not bothering to soften the blow. "You've been awful to everyone for years, Richard, not just Marcus." Richard opened his mouth to argue but closed it again. Deep down, he knew Alex was right. His behavior as interim CEO had made him few friends. "The entire company is watching this project," Richard said more quietly. "When it fails, my career is over." "Then make sure it doesn't fail," Alex replied simply. The team struggled with Marcus's complex designs. Each test brought new problems: plasma containment issues, power fluctuations, material failures at high temperatures. The specialized alloys in the design required precise manufacturing that their current equipment couldn't handle. Each failure made Richard more desperate. Marcus himself rarely visited the lab. When he did, he asked careful questions, examined results, and offered subtle suggestions rather than direct solutions. This frustrated Richard even more. Why wouldn't the man just tell them what they were doing wrong? After a particularly disastrous test where the prototype caught fire, Marcus called Richard to his office for a private meeting. Richard prepared for the worst as he rode the elevator to the top floor. Marcus's office was surprisingly modest. No expensive artwork or fancy furniture, just clean lines, practical workspaces, and large windows overlooking the test facility. Models of rockets and spacecraft lined one wall, many of them designs Richard recognized from Marcus's previous work. "Sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His expression gave nothing away. During the tense silence that followed, Marcus opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. He pushed it across the table toward Richard. "These are the real company finances, the complete records." Richard flipped through the pages, his stomach dropping. The numbers were far worse than he had reported. Projects over budget, contracts lost, investors pulling out. "You've been hiding our problems from investors," Marcus said calmly. "From the board, even from your own team leaders." Richard swallowed hard. There was no point denying it. The evidence was right there in black and white. "You're firing me?" he asked, his voice small. Marcus leaned back in his chair and studied Richard for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "That would be the easy way out, For both of us. Richard looked up, confused. I'm giving you a chance to be better, Marcus continued. The company needs this engine to work. We have 3 months before we run out of operating capital. If we don't have a successful prototype by then, 400 people lose their jobs. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the facility below. Fix the engine, Richard. Fix yourself, or leave. The choice is yours. Richard left the meeting in a daze. Instead of going home that evening, he returned to the empty lab. The silence was a welcome change from the frustrated voices of his team. He spread Marcus's original blueprints across the large table and began reviewing them for the 100th time. Hours passed as Richard traced every line, questioned every calculation. His eyes burned from fatigue, but something drove him to continue. Perhaps it was pride or fear, or maybe something deeper. A desire to prove his worth, not just to Marcus, but to himself. Near midnight, as Richard stared at the section detailing the plasma containment system, something clicked in his mind. He suddenly saw the design differently, not as separate components, but as a unified system. The magnetic field wasn't just containing the plasma. It was shaping it, directing the energy flow in a way he hadn't understood before. That's it, he whispered, his heart racing. We've been building it wrong. Richard began working frantically, sketching modifications, running new calculations. The specialized alloys weren't failing because they were flawed. They were failing because the team had assembled them in the wrong sequence, creating microscopic stress points that couldn't handle the heat. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt alive. The bitterness and anger that had consumed him faded as his mind focused entirely on the problem. This wasn't about Marcus anymore, or revenge, or even saving his career. This was about solving a fascinating technical puzzle, the very reason he had become an engineer in the first place. When the first lab technicians arrived the next morning, they found Richard surrounded by papers, his tie loose around his neck, his eyes bright with excitement despite his obvious exhaustion. Get the team together, he told them, a new authority in his voice. We're starting over. And this time, we're going to get it right. The demonstration day arrived after 6 weeks of relentless work. Richard had barely slept, driving his team with a newfound focus and determination. The prototype had passed every preliminary test, with results that exceeded even Marcus's specifications. For the first time in years, Stellar Dynamics had something revolutionary to offer, a plasma drive that could cut travel time to Mars by nearly 40%. The observation room above the test chamber had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of chairs faced the massive safety glass window that looked down on the testing area. Government officials in uniform and dark suits sat in the front row, their faces serious as they reviewed technical documents. Behind them, investors in expensive clothes whispered to each other, their excitement barely contained. The fate of Stellar Dynamics rested on the next 30 minutes. Richard stood proudly beside the engine in the test chamber. The sleek silver and copper device looked deceptively simple, its true complexity hidden inside layers of specialized alloys and precisely calibrated components. His team moved around the chamber, making final adjustments and running safety checks. Marcus entered wearing a lab coat rather than his usual suit. He walked slowly around the device, examining it from every angle. The alignment issues are fixed, Richard told Marcus, unable to keep the pride from his voice. I reconfigured the magnetic field generators and adjusted the containment sequence. It will work. Marcus nodded. Good. His face remained neutral, but Richard thought he saw a glimmer of approval in his eyes. You've done impressive work here. We're ready to begin, announced the test supervisor through the intercom. All non-essential personnel please exit the test chamber. Richard and Marcus joined the others in the observation room. The tension was palpable as they took their seats in the front row, beside the chairman and the government representatives. Richard found himself holding his breath as the countdown began. Initiating startup sequence in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. On the screen above the window, readings began to appear, power levels, temperature, plasma containment field strength. Everything looked perfect. A low hum emanated from the chamber as the engine powered up, glowing with a soft blue light that gradually intensified. Power at 25%, the technician announced. Systems nominal. Richard allowed himself a small smile. The investors behind him began to murmur approvingly. 50% power, all readings stable. The blue glow brightened, casting eerie shadows around the test chamber. Richard glanced at Marcus, who watched intently, his fingers steepled under his chin. 75%. Suddenly, a red light began flashing on the control panel. The technician frowned, typing rapidly on his keyboard. Temperature rising above expected levels, he said, a note of concern in his voice. Containment field fluctuating. Richard sat forward. That's not possible. We tested this yesterday. Before anyone could respond, more alarms began blaring. The blue glow inside the engine shifted to an angry orange as temperature readings spiked dangerously on the screen. Containment field failing. Temperature exceeding safety parameters. Shut it down. Someone yelled from the back of the room. The technicians worked frantically, but the situation worsened. Smoke began seeping from the engine seams, and a high-pitched whine filled the chamber. Emergency shutdown initiated, the lead technician announced, his voice strained. Fire suppression systems online. White foam sprayed across the test chamber, covering the engine and obscuring it from view. The alarms continued to blare as the emergency system fought to cool the overheating device. In the observation room, chaos erupted. Investors immediately began leaving, whispering urgently into phones. The government officials gathered their papers, their faces grim with disappointment. The chairman approached Marcus, his face flushed with anger. This is unacceptable. We brought every major investor and the Department of Defense representatives here today. This disaster just cost us our last chance at government funding. Thomas, we need to understand what happened, Marcus began. The board will meet tomorrow morning to discuss your position. The chairman cut him off. This company can't afford another failure. As the room emptied, Richard stood frozen, staring at the smoke-filled test chamber. Everything had been perfect in yesterday's final test. What could have changed? Later that evening, Richard sat alone in his office, reviewing the test data line by line. His career was likely over, but he needed to understand what had gone wrong. As he scrolled through the fuel mixture logs, something caught his eye. "That's not right," he muttered, sitting up straight. The fuel mixture had been altered just before the test. The ratio of deuterium changed by a critical amount. Richard checked the digital signature on the changelog. The system showed it had been authorized using Marcus's credentials, but the timestamp made no sense. Marcus had been in a meeting with the chairman at that exact time. Richard dug deeper, tracing the system access. The digital trail led to an external connection. Someone had remotely accessed their system using stolen credentials. The IP address belonged to Universal Aerospace, Stellar Dynamics' main competitor, and the user profile matched James Harrington, Marcus's former partner and now rival. Richard sat back, his mind racing. He could stay quiet, let Marcus take the fall for the sabotage. With Marcus gone, Richard might even get his old position back. No one would ever know he had discovered the truth. But as he stared at the evidence on his screen, Richard remembered the past weeks, how Marcus had given him a second chance when he deserved none, how his own passion for engineering had been rekindled by the challenge. Was he really considering throwing away his integrity to advance his career? Richard had a choice: stay silent and watch Marcus fall, or speak up and risk that Marcus might not believe him. The clock on his wall ticked loudly as he contemplated his next move. Richard didn't sleep that night. By morning, his decision was made. He printed the evidence, organized his findings, and headed to Stellar Dynamics before dawn. The board meeting was scheduled for 8:00 a.m., and he knew he needed to act quickly. The board members were already seated around the long table when Richard arrived at the conference room. Their faces showed surprise as he appeared at the door. Marcus sat at the far end, his expression calm despite the circumstances. The chairman was mid-sentence, likely discussing Marcus's replacement. Richard burst into the boardroom without waiting for an invitation. Marcus was sabotage. I have proof. All heads turned toward him. The chairman frowned. Mr. Whitman, this is a closed meeting. You'll have to. You need to see this now, Richard insisted, approaching the table and spreading out the papers he'd brought. The engine failure wasn't an accident or a design flaw. Someone deliberately changed the fuel mixture minutes before the test. He connected his laptop to the room's display screen, showing the logs and access records. The system was accessed remotely using Dr. Johnson's stolen credentials. The IP address belongs to Universal Aerospace, specifically to James Harrington's office computer. The room fell silent as board members examined the evidence. Marcus stood and walked closer to the screen, studying the data. James was my former research partner, Marcus explained to the others. He's been trying to develop a similar engine at Universal, but they're years behind our technology. Richard pointed to the timestamp. Dr. Johnson was in a meeting with Chairman Reed when these changes were made. He couldn't have done it. He turned and looked directly at Marcus. I was wrong about you. About everything. His voice grew quieter. I had a chance to stay silent and let you take the fall. 5 weeks ago, I would have done exactly that, but you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. Marcus studied Richard's face, then slowly extended his hand. This time, Richard took it without hesitation. The chairman cleared his throat. This is compelling evidence, but it doesn't change our situation. We've lost investor confidence and the government contract. Then we'll get it back, Marcus said firmly. If we can demonstrate a working engine within 1 week, we can save the company. Impossible, one board member scoffed. The prototype was destroyed. Richard shook his head. Not completely. The core components survived. With emergency funding, we can rebuild it in 3 days. I've already called my team. They're waiting for the go-ahead. After 2 hours of intense debate, the board approved emergency funds. Richard and Marcus worked side by side, day and night, sleeping on cots in the lab. Their teams merged, sharing ideas and solving problems together. Security was tightened, with new safeguards implemented to prevent another sabotage attempt. 3 days later, government officials and investors returned, skeptical but curious. This time, the test was flawless. The engine performed beyond all expectations, setting new records for efficiency and sustained power. By the end of the day, contracts were signed and Stellar Dynamics' future was secure. 5 years passed. Stellar Dynamics had grown into the industry leader in space propulsion technology. Their engines powered missions to the Moon, Mars, and beyond. The company culture had transformed too, becoming known for innovation and inclusion. On a bright morning in Florida, Richard stood beside Marcus on the VIP observation deck, watching as the countdown proceeded for the first crewed mission to Mars using their latest engine. The massive rocket gleamed white against the blue sky, steam occasionally venting from its sides as final preparations continued. 2 minutes to launch, announced the loudspeaker. Richard glanced at the crew profiles displayed on his tablet. Among the 6 astronauts were 3 graduates from the engineering program he and Marcus had started for underprivileged youth, a program now famous throughout the industry. Remember when you asked if I was lost that day in the executive lounge? Marcus asked quietly, his eyes still on the rocket. Richard nodded, embarrassed even after all these years. The memory still made him wince. We were both lost, Marcus said. You in your prejudice, me in my anger. I came to Stellar Dynamics that day looking for problems, almost wanting to find them. When you treated me that way, it confirmed what I expected to see. I'm glad you gave me the chance to prove I could be better, Richard replied. Most people wouldn't have. 30 seconds to launch, the loudspeaker announced. The rocket engines ignited, bright orange flame and white smoke billowing beneath the massive vehicle. Slowly, then with increasing speed, It rose from the launch pad, climbing toward the clear blue sky. They watched in silence as the rocket carrying their engine, their technology, and the dreams of so many people accelerated upward. The sound reached them seconds later, a deep, powerful roar that Richard felt in his chest. "Now we're found," Richard said, as the cheers of the launch team echoed around them. The rocket became smaller against the vast sky, carrying humans farther than they had ever traveled before. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "And so is humanity.